Hello, very beautiful community. We're going to talk from bed in a more rigorous analytical way today about Zelensky's trip to the United States with a plan for victory or a plan for ending the war that touches on military and economic assistance to Ukraine, Ukraine's security, Ukraine's potential alliance memberships, Ukraine's post-war reconstruction. And we'll ask what that is. Is it anything new? Is it a plan of any kind at all? What kind of victory is at stake here? And what kind of conception of victory? And what's the West's position and what's the West's response? I'm not at my best today, but I'm going to do my best, and I'm incredibly honored to have you here, even if we're speaking from bed. Grounding first, right? So I said analytical, but we've got to ground ourselves first. I call the US involvement in this conflict a benign projection of imperial power in the mode of a proxy war. So why do I use the terms imperial and proxy? Because that tends to be language that gets used by people who are skeptical of supporting Ukraine. And while I don't do policy recommendations, my position, if I have one, is that we haven't supported Ukraine fast enough and substantially enough. So why would someone with that position feel it's constructive to use language like that? A few of you have heard me legislate on this already, but I'll re-legislate because I think this is important. I think there is a 15% element here of simply disorganization, right? When you're on the internet, there's a great tendency to see the word banana and to immediately react with the word cucumber in a robotic way shaped by algorithms. So projection of imperial power, pro-Russian perspective, right? And so partly I'm using this language, just a 15% part of it, to diffuse unthinking ways of going on among supporters of Ukraine. Because if you're supporting Ukraine, you're not going to end up being on the wrong side, because you are on the right side. But you could be on the right side more or less constructively, right? In a way that leaves you more efficacious rather than more depoliticized as a citizen, and in a way that actually ends up helping the practical crisis and helping Ukraine more rather than less. That's just 15%. But the 85% is actually about emphasizing Ukraine's agency. So it's the very opposite way of using that terminology to the way it's often used. Because it's bloody hard to be a proxy of a major power while fighting for your freedom and independence, right? So somebody's broken into my house, they've occupied a part of my house, and I need a broom to chase them out, but I don't have one, I don't have anything like it, and I'm relying on my neighbor who is very busy watching Netflix and keeps giving me chopsticks and other rather ill-assorted kitchen gadgets to chase my intruder away. And I've sellotaped all the chopsticks together and I've scratched my intruder, but I haven't quite got him out because I need a couple of broomsticks, but they're not giving me broomsticks. They're talking about supporting me, but they keep watching Netflix and they're not giving me broomsticks, they're giving me chopsticks instead. And they might give me half a broomstick eventually. So it's an extremely precarious and vulnerable position in which to be, which really means that physically Ukraine is fighting the Russians. But mentally, right, Ukraine is in a fight not just with the Russians, but it's in a fight with the West to get the West to sustain commitment, to commit in new ways to keep Ukraine independent and free, or to keep Ukraine meeting some of its basic existential goals. And there's always debate about what that is, and as we'll see, there's always debate about what victory is. So, that terminology fundamentally emphasizes Ukraine's precarious agency and the fact that it's engaged in this extraordinary mental fight, not just with the Russians, whom they have the physical fight, but also with the West. Since Thucydides, reflective attitudes to conflict that are serious have always had to be in an adequate relationship with the question, how far are all the sides involved in the conflict in a considered way aware of what they're doing? How much do the sides involved know what they're doing? And the answer in conflict is that the sides very rarely know very well what they're doing. And that's reflected in both sides of this conflict, our side and the Russian side, if you allow me to align Ukraine with the West for a moment. The Russians are exercised by imperial mania, and their project is unsustainable. It's not just that it's going to be catastrophic for Russia, it's going to be catastrophic for the Putin regime, at least in the sense that the regime will not succeed in self-perpetuating in the medium term. Because the project is based on offering not much more than violence to anybody, it won't last. So it is a self-immolating imperial project. It is a certain kind of kamikaze attempt at imperial renewal that will fail. The trouble is it could fail in 2037, and that won't constitute a Ukrainian victory. That's too far away from now. On our side, we have a lack of strategy. The central cause of the lack of strategy is Western democratic incapacity. Western democracies are too fragile, too conflictive, too polarized to generate a strategy toward any conflict, including this one. In fact, if anything, we have a more strategic approach toward this conflict, arguably, than other conflicts around the world. If anything, despite the insufficient support for Ukraine, Western support for Ukraine is, if anything, a counterexample to the global trend of US power being in the mode of managing withdrawal and decline. Now, do the Russian opposition have anything strategic to propose for the region? No. Does Ukraine? No. In other words, there is no picture that is emanating out of any of the good sides here, right? Ukraine, the West, anti-Putin Russians potentially, that says this is how we work toward regional security there, right? That's not happening. So nobody's offering strategic vision here. None of the sides. So to a good extent, this is a conflict where some of the parties know what they're doing to a good extent, but there are profound ways in which no party knows what it's doing. And that doesn't mean the parties are silly. It may mean that there might just be no way to get this done, right? Imagine Ukraine made a strategic proposal for the region that went beyond liberating Ukraine and engaged with what happens on the Belarusian space, what happens on the Russian space. How far could that go if the West is completely sort of riddled with strategic incapacity? Well, not very far. So I'm not saying that there is an easy way to fix this. There is an easy way for parties to clue into suddenly knowing exactly what they're doing strategically. But that doesn't stop the fact that there is this strategic malaise from being true. So that's another bit of context. Let's jump to some of what Zelensky said, and then we'll jump to how I think what he's saying is different to Ukraine's position before and what the West's position is. Now, Zelensky was asked whether there is a plan B to whatever he is proposing, and he said, no, we are in plan B. And what we're proposing is hopefully an attempt to get us out of the plan B that we're in. What does it mean, he's asked, if Biden says no to whatever you're putting on the table? And Zelensky says that's a horrible thought. It would mean Biden doesn't, this is quoting Zelensky, Biden doesn't want to end the war in a way that denies Russia victory. And we would end up in a very long war, an impossible, exhausting situation that would kill a tremendous number of people. Having said that, I can't blame Biden for anything. At the end of the day, he took a powerful and historic step, and he chose to support us when the war started. So this is a very important last line from Zelensky, because in the way he is positioning himself, as we'll see in a moment, he is at risk of being demanding, accusatory, without himself being in a position to offer anything that is strategically clear enough for the West to embrace or reject. So that's an important line of acknowledgement. And what would you say, not to Biden, but to the American public, many of whom feel that we cannot raise our engagement and support Ukraine any further than we already have? Here is Zelensky's answer. And here Zelensky is doing something important. And it's something that's an old argument of Zelensky's administration. That's that Putin won't stop. It's actually the single best argument the Ukrainian administration have for generating support. It's the single best argument they use, rather, not necessarily the best argument they have. But it's the best of the arguments they're using. But they're not using it well. To use the argument well would mean for Zelensky to do a 1-hour lecture for a Western audience explaining why Putin won't stop. Saying that Putin won't stop here and there repeatedly in half sentences doesn't persuade anybody. It looks like it's a desire to compel the West to be there for Ukraine more, and then the deployment of a little bit of sticky tape and attaching via that sticky tape any argument that might work. So let's see what Zelensky says. I tell them that Ukraine has done everything possible to keep America out of this war, actually. Putin counted on defeating Ukraine in a quick campaign, and had Ukraine not stood its ground, Putin would have marched on. Let's consider what the consequences would have been. Number one, you'd have some 40 million immigrants in Europe, America, and Canada. Second, you'd lose the largest country in Europe, a huge blow to America's influence on the continent. Russia would now have total influence there. You'd lose everyone. Poland, Germany, and your influence would be zero. It could have been Poland, or it could have been the Baltic states, which are all NATO members. This would have been a disaster, a gut punch to the United States, because then you're definitely involved in full-scale war with troops on the ground, right? And putting your own economy on a war footing. So saying that you've been in this war for a long time is just not true. Quite the contrary. I believe that we have shielded America from total war. Now, there is a video on my main channel from long before the full-scale invasion started, with me expressing a concern about Putin challenging Article 5 in the Baltics. That's an extraordinary claim in the minds of some analysts. It's a reasonable claim in the minds of others. I'll not legislate on that now. But what I'm saying is that it is right to take Putin's escalatory project seriously, because it is largely driven by regime security. It's a defensive and existential war for Putin. And it is a war against the West. And it is a war that, for regime security reasons, one way or another, Putin, I argue, needed. There are also mystical escalatory rationales that are at hand too, about propelling Russia from the back row to the front row of nations. So this story of Putin not stopping until he's stopped is in many ways a compelling story. And I hope to come back to it soon again on the main channel. But the way Zelensky tells it here just doesn't work. The response is, it's better than nothing, but the Western response is, when it comes to the major Western powers, no, Putin won't invade Poland. Sorry. Moreover, why are you, Ukraine, so deeply committed to joining NATO and getting Article 5 protection if you think that Putin won't stop and he's going to challenge Article 5. So it's not just an argument to which the answer is, no, he won't. Yeah, the answer is not no, he won't in the Scandinavian states. It's not no, he won't in many East European states. It's not my answer, actually. But it's the answer of the major Western powers, preponderantly, no, he won't. And it's worse than that, because it's not just that we feel he won't, major Western powers say. They then see Ukraine wanting to be inside Article 5 protection. And that's surely an indication of the fact that Ukrainians themselves must think that he won't. So this argument needs to be made in a more compelling way. It's not quite compelling to, even as Zelensky has done here, produce 2 paragraphs on it. It doesn't work. You need to start by tackling the no, he won't invade Poland response. What do you think is wrong with that response? How does this war work for Putin? Right? It's not good enough to say we all know he won't stop unless he's stopped. So that argument, I think, is a very important argument, but it needs to be made better. Then Zelensky is asked about Vance and Vance's antipathic positions on Ukraine. And Zelensky then goes on to talk about the importance of a global order. We've just spoken about a lack of Western strategy. We've just spoken about how the post-1989 global order has collapsed and is not being replaced with anything else. So appealing to it is not a solution to the problem. If anything, it's an explanation of the very reason Putin invaded Ukraine. Putin invaded Ukraine because the post-1989 global order collapsed. And because Putin was co-conspired with by Western powers, who facilitated Putinism, not just as a political force controlling Russia, but as a kind of global network. It was allowed to spread its wings in Western capitals too. Zelensky says, Vance and those who share Vance's view should clearly understand that the moment they start trading in our territory is the moment they start pawning America's interests everywhere. I don't take Vance's words seriously, because if this were a plan, then America is headed for global conflict. It will involve Israel, Lebanon, Iran, Taiwan, China, as well as many African countries. That approach would broadcast to the world the following implicit rule: I come, I conquer, and now it's mine. And this rule will apply everywhere. We'll end up in a world where might is right. It'll be a completely different world, a global shutdown. And here I think Zelensky is appealing to a world that isn't there. The very problem we've got is the thing that he is appealing to is broken down. And he is not proposing a reconstituted global order. He is appealing to a global order that has collapsed. And that's surface politics, because it doesn't cut through to the actual situation where we find ourselves. Now, Zelensky is asked about the Kursk invasion. What's the motive? Who is the intended audience? Is it Putin, to show him that Ukraine can go on the offensive? Is it Ukraine's Western partners, to demonstrate to them that Ukraine can achieve quite a lot, given the right resources? Zelensky says both of these motives are important. But there is more at stake here, and he makes a few military remarks at this point, and then says, imagine that you're struggling in a tough war, you're not receiving aid, you strain to maintain morale, and the Russians have the initiative. You have to do something other than endlessly asking your partners for help. What do you do? Right? That certainly is a very compelling statement about Ukraine's predicament. Zelensky goes on to say, of course, you're right to wonder if this action will go down in history as a success or a failure. It's too early to judge. And here is a return, if you like, to some of the analyses I have shared, where I've argued that, in part, whether the Kursk incursion succeeds or fails is a matter of, short-term history. But in part, and it's galvanized certain political forces in a constructive way for Ukraine, I believe. It has demonstrated that it's possible for the West to reconsider its rules of engagement around Western weaponry. It's demonstrated that there are some myths around to do with Russia's sort of inexorably structured in advantage in this war, that Ukraine has demonstrated it may not be as true as it's thought in Western centers of power, that simply the longer the war goes, the more of an advantage Russia will accrue. Zelensky says, I'm not saying it's a resounding success, or it'll bring the war to an end, or it'll be the end of Putin. But what it has done is show our partners what we're capable of. And we've also shown the global South that Putin, who claims that everything under control is under control, in fact, doesn't have everything under control. So let's make a few analytical remarks about this on top of what we've said so far. Now, it's important for Zelensky to get the tone right. And that means two things. That means speaking in a way that's sufficiently political. And I do think roughly he is doing that. He's appealing to political arguments, which I have questioned, but they're not just moral arguments, that Ukraine is a democracy, Ukraine is democracy fighting for its freedom, and there is a moral obligation to support Ukraine, backed up by humanitarian outrage amongst Western populations. That's an argument that worked powerfully for Ukraine in the first year. It doesn't work very well at all, and it shouldn't be centered. It's still to some degree being centered by the Zelensky administration, and it shouldn't be centered in my analysis. And then the tone is very difficult to strike for Zelensky, because the risk is to be too demanding and too accusatory in the way that undermines Ukraine's chances of getting more help. But at the same time, he needs to say, hey, we're not asking for help. We're asking for something that is in your strategic interest. So the question is always, how far is this balanced properly in whatever Zelensky is communicating? Now, let's look at Ukraine's old arguments and Ukraine's newer arguments for Western support. So we've just mentioned one old argument, which is a moral argument. Another age-old argument that Ukraine has been making is a global order argument, and I've just said why that argument is problematic. It's a good space in which to make an argument. You should absolutely be making an argument in terms of a global order, but it shouldn't be exclusively in terms of appeal to a global order that isn't quite there anymore. And then Zelensky is again making an age-old argument, which is that Putin won't stop, which I think is a very good argument, but I believe that argument needs to be better made. But I think there are some new arguments that Ukraine is making. And they are really about displacing the disappointment of the failed counteroffensive months and months ago with something else that isn't any longer about regaining territory. Look at how much territory we have regained. We can win back us. But it's about taking Russian territory, Kursk, and is about long-distance attacks on Russian soil that are effective. That's to say, we can do a good amount of damage to the Russians, and that's going to destabilize them and make them think, potentially. So don't underestimate Ukraine's capacity, don't underestimate Ukraine's ingenuity, and don't swim about too much in myths about Russia's strength. So we're displacing, look, we can regain territory with, look, we can cause a lot of trouble for the Russians and we can invade them too. There is then an additional argument, which is, look at us in Kursk. It means Russia's nuclear blackmail is bogus. And we'll have a separate conversation on the main channel, Health Allowing, about Russia's red lines, Russia's supposed red lines. So we can take Russia's territory. We can cause problems for the Russians with significant damage being done by attacks deep into Russian territory. And we can also demonstrate that the excessive caution about nuclear escalation management has been unwise on the part of the West. That seems to me to be new. Now, a good question is, what does Zelensky actually have to offer by way of a victory plan, by way of a conception of a victory, or by way of a conception of stopping the war, except the argument that the Ukraine just needs more support? It's not clear what the answer to that question is. And it's very important to recognize that it would be a very difficult road for Ukraine to go on to try to get the West to be more strategic about the conflict than it is. Because the West's strategic incapacity is constitutive, right? It's in part conditioned by Western democratic decline. But I believe that challenging the West's strategic incapacity is an important prong, is an important case to make, and is actually a better direction in which to push than an appeal to a global order in terms of which we still talk, but in which we only half believe. An important question that arises is, what does Ukraine want to happen to Russia versus what does the West want to happen to Russia? And here there is a very significant divergence. It's not the West's position that there should be regime change in Russia. And it's not the West's position that the Putin regime should be brought to its knees. Because the West is worried not just about nuclear escalation, but dramatic destabilization on Russian soil. The West already has some very nasty experiences with regime change leading to the collapse of a state in Iraq. And so there's real concern about things going really pear-shaped on Russian space. The West has. Whereas Ukraine sees that largely as a path to its liberation. So there's a discrepancy of visions there. And the question that arises next is, could Zelensky be also making an analytical mistake in how he is approaching the West for sustenance of support? You could argue that Zelensky's position is based on the assumption that the West is not backing Ukraine more because it doesn't think Ukraine can win. And if you're familiar with my analyses, they are that that's not the central issue, that the central issue is that the West doesn't want Ukraine to win. The West wants Ukraine to survive. So, come on, can't you see that we can do it? Is then it's going to run into the wall of the answer that says, we're not sure you can do it, but even if you could do it, we don't want you to. Or, even if we wanted you to, we feel we can't sustainably back you to that level, even if you could do it if we backed you that way. So we can't, or we don't want to give you this backing in a way that's independent of whether you can do the job or not if we back you. So there is a risk here of running into a wall, which is the West's commitment not to Ukrainian victory, but to Ukraine's survival. We try to push Ukraine to move toward um, backing Ukraine's victory when it isn't in a position, or doesn't think it is in a position to do that. If the West had sound democratic strength at home and the capacity for a strategy, Ukraine could have been backed towards some conception of a victory by the West that maybe even included chasing Putin out of power. I don't think that's entirely unfeasible in the first 18 months of the war. That's just not where the West was at. And then questions arise about what Ukraine's own conception of victory is. Is it territorial liberation? Now, of course, many people in Zelensky's own administration no longer think territorial liberation is possible, whatever they say in public. But beyond that, would territorial liberation stop the war? If this is a fundamental regime security enterprise for Putin, the war will just continue if Ukraine regains all of its territory. So, questions arise, and these are questions not just about what Ukraine tells the West, but what Ukraine tells itself, about what a victory looks like. And Ukraine is now going through a very difficult period of redefinition, whereby a victory via full territorial liberation may not be available. But then the question arises, what else does a victory look like? We can begin clarifying that. It would certainly look like Ukraine, it would need to look like Ukraine retaining its sovereignty, Ukraine retaining enough territory for economic and political sustenance, and Ukraine getting security guarantees from the West. Even if they're not NATO security guarantees, they have to be real security guarantees, because Putin will go again because he has to go again if he can go again. Something else that we're running into in the West is a political momentum towards stopping the conflict if it can be stopped. I believe the Harris administration would only try to do this in a way that's sustainable enough for Ukraine, and the Trump administration would try to do it in a way that's unsustainable for Ukraine if it could. But that momentum is there. The trouble is that Ukraine has to fight for its freedom and independence, and it cannot settle for things that are incompatible with that. Right? That certainly includes any threats to its sovereignty. That means not a situation where it doesn't have Western security guarantees. Ukraine can't really negotiate without having a sense of what Western security guarantees it's going to get. And it also means Ukraine having economic and political sustenance, Ukraine having the capacity to rebuild, and it means Ukraine not conceding that any of its territories that Russia's confiscated illegitimately are Russian. Ukraine can never admit that. So Ukraine would need to look at territorial compromise, right, without recognizing this territory as Russian. They'll need to say something like, well, we agree to not try to regain the territory by military means, but we still view the territory as ours, and we're in favor of any political avenue of getting the territory back in the future, but we're not going to go about this by military means. So if the Ukrainian government were to try to recognize this territory as being Russian, it would just lose power. It would not be politically sustainable. So there's some minimal red lines Ukraine has in its fight for its freedom. The problem is that Putin is fighting a defensive and existential war, and he can't stop either. So for Putin, from our point of view, thinking about Putin's logic here, we need to bring it about that Putin doesn't use a cessation of a war simply as a way to win the war better later. So this is all extraordinarily difficult, And my answer to Western strategic incapacity is that the West can do 10-20% better strategically. I don't think the strategic incapacity problem can be solved, but it can do better strategically. And I think it's important for the Ukrainian administration to make the most compelling arguments it can to provoke the West into being more seriously committed to a sustainable way out of this conflict that keeps Ukraine safe and free, if not territorially whole. This could go on for a long time, so I'm just going to cut off for now. I'm sorry this has been a challenging and somewhat pessimistic conversation. I don't think this is a catastrophically pessimistic conversation. And just to end, I'll reiterate that it's important to not underestimate Russian strength, but also not to overestimate it, not to go about with various kinds of myth-making about Russia's red lines and about the sustainability of this enterprise for the Putin regime beyond some of the realistic restrictions it might run into. Thank you for being with me, and lots of love for today.